Welcome to today's 10 Minutes of Torah. What I want to deal with today is the question of two psukim in the parsha, which seem very unusual. The first is found in Perek Bet, Pasuk Yud Aleph, where the Torah writes, Kol hamincha asher takrivu laHashem lo ta'aseh chametz, that no mincha, none of the meal offerings that you would bring for God shall be made with leaven, Ki kol seor v'chol devash lo taktiru mimenu isha laHashem. For no leaven or leavening agents or honey may be turned into the offering, the smoke offering that you're giving by fire to God. On this pasuk, Rashi explains that it's not just the classic date honey, but it's any kind of sweetener is prohibited from being used in a korban. We know that it can't be chametz, and we know that it can't be sweet. But then, just two psukim later, the Torah says, "V'kol korban minechatecha b'melach timlach," that every offering has to be salted. V'lo tashbit melach brit elokecha, and you shall not omit from your meal offering the salt of the covenant. And then it concludes, Al kol korbanecha takriv melach, that every offering has to have salt within the offering. And the question I would pose to us is the simple one. On the one hand, the Torah said you can't put any additives. You can't include the ingredients in the korban that would make it rise. And you can't put in any kind of sweetener. And yet, on the other hand, you have to have an additive. You have to have salt. The Rambam explains that the reason why both leaven and honey were prohibited is because that's the way the pagans used to offer their sacrifices. Their sacrifices were risen, and their sacrifices were sweet. And therefore, we have an obligation, as the Rambam discusses over and over again, to distance ourselves from their practices and make sure that our sacrifices, our korbanot, are unique to us. The second explanation, which is offered, is by the Medrash Lekach Tov. The Medrash Lekach Tov explains that ultimately what a korban was supposed to do is break a person's heart. It was supposed to have an emotional impact on the person because, as the rabbis teach us, we should look at these korbanot as if they're being offered in our places. As we discussed earlier this week with the korban chatat, that when we sin and we need to bring a korban, ultimately what we're saying is that we didn't have control. We weren't masters of our own actions. We were, in some respects, no different than the animal we're about to sacrifice. In this case, the mincha, the flour that we're bringing, has to maintain something that won't provide for it any sense of growth. It won't rise because of leaven, and it won't be improved because of the honey, because we're walking forward to God in a sacrifice with a sense of humility. But still, why is melach required? Why do you have to add salt? On this, the Ramban suggested because salt is a sense of permanence. It is something that can keep food fresh for a longer period of time. The idea of a korban is that we're ready to change, and we want our change to be permanent. And so, unlike the prohibitions of honey and of leaven, salt, says the Ramban, is necessary because this will preserve the lessons of the korban for us further. The Emek Davar says, actually, salt also teaches us another message as well. Salt by itself is very bitter tasting. You can't eat salt. And yet when salt is mixed with some other food, it enhances and enriches the taste of that food. And so as a result, we want to use the salt. We want to understand that what was wrong, was bitter, and what will be enhanced and will be better, which is similar in explanation to something that was taught by Reb Mordechai Gifter, the late Rosh Yeshiva of Telz Yeshiva in Cleveland, who in his Pirkei HaTorah explains that while it's true that both salt and honey are additives, there's a difference in the way they operate. Because honey and also the leaven are things that improve the taste. They improve the taste by changing it. The sweet wasn't there before. The leaven wasn't there before. They change, in essence, the nature of the food itself. And that change is external. It's an external transformation, where salt, on the other hand, preserves the food and enhances it. What is the difference then between something that is external and changing versus something that's internal and enhancing? Said Rav Gifter, it's that our service of God, our worship of God, needs to be real. It needs to be genuine. It needs to come from who we are, as opposed to being things that are imposed upon us from the outside. We need to approach God, draw closer to Him, and bring out our true selves, the real flavor that we have in our relationship, just like the salt accomplishes in a korban. We don't want to clothe ourselves with a falseness, clothe ourselves with other people's personalities or perceptions of who we should be. We want to be who we authentically are. And that's the symbolism, said Rav Gifter, of the salt within every korban. It's similar to ideas that we have throughout life, that every person is different. Every Jew is different. Every Jew has their own strengths and their own weaknesses. And our responsibility is to be the best person we can be. It's the story of Zusha, who was afraid when he went up to Shamayim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not going to ask him, how come you weren't like a Moshe Rabbeinu, because he wasn't. But rather he was afraid that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would ask him, how come you weren't as good as Zusha should be? That's the challenge of the salt with the korban. The reason we need to have the salt, the reason why it is identified as the covenant, because it's core to our experience, versus the honey, and versus the leaven. Things that change are totally external. May you have a very wonderful Shabbat. May this Shabbat continue to be one filled with health, safety, and happiness. Shabbat Shalom.